Great. Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, depending on when you are or where you are. Everyone, my name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. And thank you for joining another NOVEC talk. We will follow a very similar agenda than in previous talks. I will have a little welcome for everyone, give you a little bit of information. Then we will have our early career researcher pre-recorded video for this week, which is Kati Kishbar-On from Tel Aviv University. And then we will have our main speaker, Dr. Alexander Vostrotnikov from Maastricht University, and 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. As always, a small reminder that the NOVEC Talks speaker series is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics with the support of our two partner programs, the PPE program and the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences. We are a research center at the University of Pennsylvania that works with organizations all around the world in consulting, research, and training to sustainably enact positive behavioral change. You can see more information about us in our link. You can follow us on Twitter if you follow that QR code. Yes, and that's it on that side. Our Spring 2022 program, which you probably already know, we are doing talks every 2 weeks on Thursdays at the same time in the same link. There was a small change on our March 24 speaker. The previous speaker will now speak in the summer, and we have a new person. So this has been updated in our website if you want more information. And a very brief reminder that I also gave in the last talk is that we are very close now to launching our blog for the center, and we are always continuously welcoming proposals for posts. It's a great way to disseminate your work among our academic and also practice-based audiences. And we also have a monthly center bulletin in which basically every month we share news about what our members are doing, publishing, presenting, and so on. So it's a great way to get news from our work in behavioral science and related areas. I can post later the links in the chat, or you can follow the QR codes, or simply find everything on our website. A few ground rules. If this is the first time that you're joining, please mute yourself during the talk. If you can, please keep your camera on so that we have a more interactive experience. For questions, you can either use the chat at any time. And today, as in previous occasions, we have a co-author in the audience. Or you can use the raise hand function at the end during the allocated time for questions. And as always, we are transmitting live on Facebook, and the recordings of all our sessions are available in our website. Next week, we will upload the video of this session as well. And with that, let me introduce our NOVEC Early Career Researcher for this week. Kati Kishbar-On is a PhD student at Tel Aviv University in Israel. And the presentation is called The Interplay of Social Identity and Norm Psychology in the Evolution of Human Groups. Let me share the video. And Kati is here in the audience as with our previous ECRs as well. So feel free to ask questions or comments in the chat. I'll actually check one thing, sorry. Yes. Sorry about that. Just 1 minute. Okay, you should be seeing the video there.
Hi, my name is Katika Jibaron, and I'm a PhD student in Tel Aviv University. Today I'll be presenting you a joint project with Ehud Lam about how insights from social identity theory combined with insights from norm psychology can provide us a more comprehensive account of group behavior. Now, people's attitude towards social norms play a crucial role in understanding group behavior. But what makes people follow certain norms in certain social circumstances, while in other social circumstances they follow entirely different, perhaps even contradicting, social norms? Why do some people smoke when socializing with friends, while the same people would never light up a cigarette in family gatherings or in workplaces? In this paper, we want to evaluate the possibility that to better understand people's adherence to social norms, we must simultaneously take into account theories about norm psychology alongside theories about social identity theory. Now, social identity theory was developed in the early 70s by the social psychologist Henrietta Juffel and his colleagues. They found out that people tend to immediately identify and establish in-group and out-group attitudes, even in random, meaningless, and temporary group assignments. They distinguish between three mental processes that occur when people classify themselves and others as belonging to the in-group or to the out-group. And the first is social categorization, when we assign people to social categories that tells us something about them. The second is social identification, when people adopt the identity of their group and conform to the group norm. And the third is social comparison, when people compare their own group with other groups in order to maintain a feeling of superiority. Now, social norms are part of the second stage of social identification, but they are often described solely as attributes of the group, and as such, individuals do not necessarily have a deep sense of personal commitment to those norms. Since people change groups very often, they also change their norms very quickly, so norms are not necessarily internalized. However, a different picture regarding social norms emerges when we shift the focus to an individual's norm psychology. Norm psychology refers to the psychological underpinnings of norm-governed behavior. This figure, taken from Chudik's and Henrik 2011 paper, suggests that there are several mechanisms for sustaining cooperation in social norms that operate within groups and affect intergroup competition, and this selects for the psychological adaptations for norms. In turn, these psychological adaptations facilitate cooperation within the group and competition between groups. One of the components of norm psychology is the ability to acquire norms. Norms are acquired through processes of norm internalization, in which norms become goals in themselves, as in such, become a significant part of a person's identity. Now, processes of norm internalization begin in early childhood, which makes it extremely difficult to change an individual's internalized norm. The internalization of norms helps people navigate the social landscape, but it also implies a less flexible behavior, since once you internalize a norm, it becomes a part of your personality that is much less subject to change. Now, from putting these two pictures side by side arises the question, what is being internalized? According to norm psychology accounts, people's attitude towards social norms is determined by norm internalization, and it is through norm internalization that an individual acquires her status as an in-group member. Social identity theory, however, proposes an opposite picture, when an individual's attitude towards social norms is determined by her level of identification with the group, and it is only when she categorizes herself as a group member that she follows the group norms. We want to suggest that human behavior is shaped by both approaches. Norm psychology theories focus on different psychological characteristics than social identity theory, and vice versa. Nonetheless, each approach acknowledges the relevance of the other, even if only as a marginal sidekick. We propose an integrated approach that views people's behavior as residing within some sort of a continuum, ranging from flexible attitudes towards norms to less flexible attitudes towards norms. The ability of people to recall and adopt norms and to notice and condemn norm violators is influenced by processes of social identity as well, and their ability to favor group identity or change norms when it is socially necessary is influenced also by processes of norm acquisition and activation. Depending on the social context, both norm content and social identity may be adjusted by the individual. This adjustment, we suggest, is the result of the mutual influence that processes of norm internalization have on social identity and that processes of social identity have on individuals' norm-governed behavior. So to conclude, we want to suggest that the internalization of social identity and social norms are processes that interact constantly and are hard, if not impossible, to separate. Both affect human predisposition to impose social categories that produce group boundaries. Now, in complex societies, normative behavior results from the negotiation of social identity, since people need to adjust quickly to the changing social circumstances. The interplay of norms with dynamic social identity can often lead to a mismatch between a society's degree of tightness and the degree of individuals' commitment to the group norms. And therefore, it can also explain why a country with many conservative groups appears to be relatively loose and the other way around. So this is it. If you have any comments or questions, please contact me. And if you want to read the full version of the paper, please scan this QR code. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy, for this presentation. As I always say, I'm sorry we don't have time for live questions for this section, but Kathy is in the audience, so feel free to write there any questions, comments, anything you want. And with that, I'll introduce our main speaker for today, Dr. Alexander Vostroknutov. He's an associate professor of economics at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota in 2008. And apart from Minnesota and Maastricht, he has worked as a research fellow at the University of Trento. He's interested in studying both strategic and non-strategic decision-making using the framework of behavioral economics with the toolbox of experimental and neuroeconomics and recently field applications. His main research interest is social norms and their role in economic decision-making. And his recent work concentrates on the theoretical models of moral behavior and evolutionary foundations of preferences, beliefs, and rationalities. The talk today is called Affective Decision-Making and Moral Sentiments. And as in previous occasions as well, Dr. Oikon Demand will be moderating. Dr. Demand is an associate professor of practice in behavioral and decision sciences here at Penn and a core member of our center. So thank you so much, Alex, for joining, and yeah, you can proceed.
Should I share the screen? No.
Yes. Can you still do it?
Yeah.
Great. Perfect.
Is this okay?
Looks good.
Okay, shall I start or?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me for this great series that I enjoy a lot and I come very often to listen. So what I will talk today about is affective decision-making and moral sentiments. This is a joint paper with Eric Kimbrough from Chapman University, who is also in the audience. And please, so if you write any questions, he can answer in the chat. So before I start, I want to show you this graph of many papers that we were writing about morality and norms. So we kind of try to develop a framework in which you can study normative behavior. So for now, we have 3 papers. The first one is called The Theory of Injunctive Norms, where we provide evidence of moral behavior and how our theory of norms kind of accounts for it. And then there are 2 other papers, one about moral reasoning and one about moral sentiments. So this paper, moral reasoning paper, refers to rational agents with norms and how they behave and how they reason about morality. But the paper I will going to talk about today is about moral sentiments and affective decision making. So both of these papers kind of feed into the evidence paper that which is a theory of injunctive norms. So to give you a roadmap of the talk, first I will give you an introduction and talk about evolution of preferences and how evolution enters kind of our thinking about social norms. Then I will talk about individual behavior of affective agent that I'm going to describe to you. Then I will talk about personal identity and social identity and describe to you how we conceptualize the emergence of cooperation among these agents that I will show you on different levels. So personal identity will have one level of kind of light level of cooperation, then social identity will have more kind of sophisticated cooperation levels that can be achieved. Okay, so we know pretty well from a lot of research that affect emotions and the way we feel at the moment, which is called mood usually, that all these things influence our decision making. So there are many examples of this. Prospect theory, for example, accounts for some biases in choices that deviate from expected utility theory. Then there are many different phenomena that economists have been interested in, like procrastination, addiction, time inconsistency, and many others, which do not fit well into rational choice framework. So there are many models within behavioral economics that address different parts of this conundrum, sort of. So there are models of procrastination, of addiction, of time inconsistency, etc. However, as Arthur J. Robson suggested, this is a famous economist for those who doesn't know. So he suggested essentially that if we want to have unified treatment of all these phenomena, then we need to consider biological evolution of preferences, beliefs, and rationality. So what he meant essentially is that we need some biological foundation for economic theory, and without that we will stay in this state of multiplicity of behavioral theories. So what we do in this paper, we essentially follow his advice and propose a model of a boundedly rational affective agent who has beliefs and preferences and some version of rationality that are subject to some biological constraints that I will describe to you. So the view we have about decision-making in general is that there are two selves, essentially. There is a rational self, which can reason about morality in rational way or using logic. And there is an affective self that has emotions, feelings, and moral sentiments. So it has some emotions related to social interactions and cooperation. So in this paper, we will consider the affective self. And we, like rational self is depicted in other two papers that I just showed you. So what are the biological constraints that we discuss in this paper and on which we build this new kind of boundedly rational agent? So the first constraint is it's a general idea more than a constraint that evolution is a stingy engineer that essentially tries to build some decision-making mechanisms from what already exists in the animals from which this evolves. So in our case, it's mammalian brain architecture. So how do we take this into account? So imagine that this agent, affective agent, whom I here will depict as a bear, walks in the forest, and there are different features of the environment that this agent faces. So there is, for example, a river, there is an apple tree in one place, and then in another place, there is river and apple tree together. So the agent has some affective values attached to these features of the environment. So for example, if the agent ate an apple from an apple tree in the past, he will remember this, and the value of the apple tree will be high if apple was tasty. And if the agent caught a fish from the river, then that value of that fish will be recorded in the value of the river. So all features that the agent sees in the environment or can perceive in any way all have some affective values attached to them due to past experience with these features. So suppose now that the agent is surrounded by some features. So what we mean by the word surrounded is like essentially the environment in which you currently are. So each of you probably are sitting in some room with some features in it, I don't know, a lamp or a table or something. So this is your environment, and the affective values of the features that are present in your environment, they kind of create your mood in the sense that you sum up all these affective values of all the features that currently surround you, and you get your mood or reference point V. So then what happens? when you are surrounded by these features, you can have some experience. For example, if an agent goes to the place where there is a river and an apple tree, he can catch a fish, eat it, get an apple, eat it as well, and maybe he has a headache at the moment, or something else. Then whatever the agent experiences while being surrounded by these features is recorded in his affect V prime. So which is, for example, affective value of fish, of an apple, and a headache together. And then essentially what the agent feels is the prediction error, or the difference between his mood, current mood, which is created by surrounding features, and this affect that the agent felt while being among them. So this difference is a prediction error, is a very kind of famous term in neuroscience, where people think that essentially this lies at the core of all decision making, and that these prediction errors allow us to navigate our environment. So this is general ideas that essentially we didn't invent this, but just took it from general neuroscience approaches to these things. Okay, so what happens next once the agent experienced this emotion? So then comes in the reinforcement learning part. So reinforcement learning is a known way of how mammals and maybe other animals also learn in their environments. So how do we conceptualize it here is we assume that an agent, after experiencing V prime, updates all the features in the environment. So this happens in the following way. So remember, this was the emotion that the agent felt. So then if it's a positive emotion, then both river and the tree will be updated by this difference times some lambda, which is just a discount factor, and then added to the previous value that was recorded for that feature. And then this whole value will be then the new value for the feature river, for example. And the same happens for the feature tree. So what is interesting to note about this is that co-occurring features influence each other's affective values. So for example, if an agent comes to the place where there is a river and a tree and catches a fish, then the value of nearby apple tree will also be updated because agent is happy eating fish in some environment. So he updates all features that are in it. Why do we assume this? Is because essentially we try to have a boundedly rational agent which doesn't really think too much about the environment, or that some specific features produce the effect that he felt. So we assume that the agent doesn't reason about any of this and just updates all features. So this can be a nice property, but also a not very nice property, because you can imagine that if an agent, for example, has a headache and experiences something bad, then he will record negative values into the river and the tree, even though it's completely, not related to neither tree or the river, right? Because a headache has nothing to do with this. So, however, nonetheless, if this mechanism is in action, then it can lead to what we call irreality, or the state where you have unreasonable affective values. For example, if I had a headache while being next to the river, I start to not like the river, so I don't go there to catch a fish anymore, because I feel that the river is not a good place for me to be. And this, of course, can also apply to many other things. For example, if you go to Paris and suddenly catch a cold, then you feel bad, you don't like Paris, then you come back home and suddenly you get a job offer from Paris and you reject it because you think that you do not like Paris, even though this whole thing happened just because you had cold while being there, right? So this kind of updating can have some not very efficient, let's say, economic consequences. Okay, so imagine that we have an agent like this. So now, how does this agent choose? So if we have situation under certainty where an agent has some specific actions from which to choose, for example, A, B, C, and D. So these vertical arrows represent the y-axis on which affective values are measured. So this picture essentially means that if the agent chooses A, he gets array. If he chooses B, he gets RB, etc. So in situations under certainty, agent chooses the same way as any rational agent. So he just chooses the action that leads to the highest affective value, which is C. So what happens then? So agent comes to some environment which determines his mood VT. Then he makes a choice among 4 actions, chooses C. He receives RC, and then updating happens. So of all the features that were that surrounded the agent at the time of choice. So then all these features will be updated with this value, as I just described before. This is the difference between your mood, between what you got and your mood multiplied by a coefficient, and then you just update all features. So this is a kind of a standard cycle of how this agent lives its life. It comes to some place, chooses something, receives some affective value, and then updates all the features around, then goes somewhere else, and this process repeats again. So an interesting thing, though, is to understand how this agent would choose under uncertainty. And this is kind of a main part of our of this agent, essentially, which will be different from the rational agent. So
let me just pause you real quick, if you don't mind. There are a couple of questions about assumptions that you make in a model. Eric was addressing them, but maybe you want to speak to that too, right? So there was a question about what justifies the assumption that emotional update is the same for all features. And then I sort of asked a related question, which is, if you have sort of this random noise in your environment, like the headaches and whatnot, whether that's not something that you can anticipate and sort of factor into, how you create the updating, because it's sort of random, it's not really related to the actual thing, or whether that's captured in a lambda or so. So maybe you can just speak to how this updating works and what your assumptions are.
Yeah, so about why all features are updated, I actually forgot to say about it. So I put the slides here like Pavlov's dog. So imagine what happens to Pavlov's dog. When it eats some food, there is a ring, the bell is ringing, right? So the dog associates food with the ringing or with the noise or with the bell or something, right? This is exactly what this describes, right? So there is some feature which is completely unrelated to what you are doing. Nonetheless, you still update it when you have good, pleasurable experience. Sorry, Eugen, I forgot what was the second thing?
It was just
about noise.
Yeah, the noise, yeah. The updating.
Yeah, so anticipating some noisy emotions, it's probably possible, but this involves cognitive abilities, we believe. So this system on its own, it doesn't understand that there are some noisy consequences. So it just takes everything as given.
Sounds great. Christina has a follow-up, yeah. Christina.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. So I understand that you may give different emotional values to different features of the environment. But a previous question is, basically, there is an attention issue. In the following sense, you don't have just the river and the tree, we usually are surrounded by features. And the question is, we pay attention more to certain features versus others, okay? Even because they are in front of us. It's not so much an emotional weighting of the feature, it's just a cognitive weighting of the, this feature. Now, do you take this into account? Because it seems to me that you are assuming that basically all the features around have more or less the same cognitive value. You may pay attention to all of that, but this is not true. We only pay attention to some, and then the emotional part comes in. Because what it looks that you say is that the emotional part comes first and makes me pay attention to F1, F2, F3. But in fact, it's the opposite. Okay, there is a cognitive step, the first, and then there is the emotional value that I give to these different things. These are two very different things. I want to understand how you treat this.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. This is a very good point. So what we do here, we do not consider what you say, any attention, we do not consider it in this paper. And the reason is that what we try to do is we try to construct a model of an agent which is completely disattached from all the cognitive things. So I will not mention this in this talk, but we understand, of course, that there is a lot of, talking between cognitive and emotional system. But this, we leave for the future research to figure out how exactly this happens. What we try to do now is to kind of have a model of one agent which completely lacks all cognitive abilities, essentially, and because that will allow us to later see what kind of behavioral things that this agent has, which are not very nice, that cognitive system might try to actually, resolve in some sense. So we find this approach kind of fruitful in the sense that if we see what behavioral biases and kind of inefficiencies that are produced by this one affective agent, which completely is, devoid of any reason, then we will understand clearer why reasoning even evolved, for example. So yeah, thanks, Christina. Let me continue. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so now let us think about situations with uncertainty. So how would this agent resolve this? So imagine that you have this full insurance problem. So you can either pay some amount of money S for insurance, in which case you have minus S, and then nothing bad happens to you because insurance company covers all expenses of anything. Or you can consume S now and then later have, or maybe not now, but just keep S and then have uncertainty over, let's say, outcome 0 and minus 100. So, and of course, what's important here is that minus S is in between S and S minus 100, because then if this was, let's say, below or above, this would not, then it wouldn't be an interesting problem to consider. So we assume that this S is in between these two values so that it's a, interesting problem. So the main kind of assumption that we make about how affective agent can resolve this problem is to notice that essentially affective agent lives in the world of affective values, and there is nothing else in there, essentially. So if I'm in some environment and I have a mood, which is the sum of all affective values of features in this environment, then essentially the agent treats this value VT. So now I put subindex T to make sure, because it's going to be in time in the next slide. So this mood essentially contains all the information about this environment that the agent can possibly have, because his world consists, or Umwelt, there is a nice word from theoretical biology about this. So essentially, this is the only information that agent has. So we assume that agent uses this mood, his mood or this information to resolve uncertainty, essentially. And we propose the following way how this might be done. So suppose you have some mood Vt at time t, and then you have uncertainty over two options, S and S minus 100. So then what you do, you compare your mood to these options and find the one which is the closest. So suppose your mood is here, then S is the closest option to your mood. And then once you found the closest option, you just start to believe that that option will take place. Why you believe this? Because you believe that Vt contains all the information about the environment, so the closest option is probably the most likely to happen. So of course, agent really does not think that, because it's a very mechanical, in a sense, agent. But we believe that this is what evolution kind of programmed into it. So we call this process mood affiliation, following Tyler Cowen, who actually mentioned some similar process happening in his blog. Okay, so essentially this process allows the agent to reduce problem under uncertainty to a problem under certainty, because when he starts to believe that one of the uncertain outcomes will happen, he can just take uncertainty and replace it with that outcome, and then choose as if it's a problem under certainty. To show you an example, I go back again to similar problem like the insurance problem, only with general payoffs. And I will show you how simple kind of intuition about prospect theory, for example, can emerge from this. So imagine that you are choosing between two actions, or the agent choosing between two actions, A1 and A2. A2 gives you amount Z for sure, and action A1 leads to a lottery where you can get an X or a Y. So then suppose that your mood is very good, so you are very happy. So then what happens? Notice first that your mood-dependent belief will be X, because X is the closest value to V of the two, right? So essentially, when you are very happy, you will believe that uncertainty will resolve in a nice way. And then you will choose A1 because X is bigger than Z. So you believe that X will happen. So then you compare X to Z and choose A1. So in the terminology of prospect theory, what does it mean? So what we have here is an agent with very high mood, right, or reference point, which means that all these payoffs are now in the loss domain. And so our affective agent makes risk-loving choice in the loss domain, and we can also call him overconfident because he believes that uncertainty will resolve in a very nice way, right? So this we can call overconfidence. And similarly, if let's say you have very bad mood, which is here, then you will have a mood-dependent belief that Y will happen because it's the closest outcome out of these two to your mood. And then you will compare Y to Z and choose A2 because Z is bigger than Y, right? So notice again that when you are very sad, everything is in the gain domain. So all these payoffs are higher than your current mood. And then essentially you will be choosing something risk averse in the gain domain. And we can call this also underconfidence because you believe that uncertainty will resolve in a bad way. So essentially, this simple idea about how affective agent resolves uncertainty allows us to replicate some common tenets of prospect theory, which we find very appealing in the sense that essentially, so this very simple idea can replicate the prospect theory assumptions that were made in it. Okay, so this essentially finalizes the description of how affective agent behaves in individual choice problems. And notice as well that since this agent does not really reason rationally, it does not predict who will do what in the future, it doesn't strategize in any way. Essentially, then what happens is that the choice under uncertainty becomes the most general problem that this agent faces at all. So if you take any environment of any complexity, this agent will see it as some problem under uncertainty, which for us is very nice because it means that we can predict what this agent will do in almost any environment, no matter how complex it is. The reason why we can do it is literally because the agent essentially ignores all the complexity that is there and chooses in a very simple way. Okay, so now let me talk about our second set of biological constraints and how this leads to some kind of social interactions between these agents. So many literatures noted that humans are extremely prosocial species, so we're much more prosocial than apes or any other animals. So this means essentially that evolution should have created special mechanisms for cooperation. So what we propose is that moral sentiments or social emotions related to some social interactions and cooperation are evolved adaptations that help affective agents to live in groups and cooperate. And similar arguments, of course, have been proposed in cultural group selection literature and in gene culture coevolution literatures. So given that affective agents do not really think and they're not rational, the only way that they can really cooperate is if they have similar preferences. So cooperation here, I view more like, so I use sometimes word working together in these slides. So by this, I mean kind of a mixture of cooperation and coordination, like when you work with someone on a common project. So if you have similar preferences, meaning that you have affective values of different features which are the same, then if you work on a common project, you will want to do the same thing, right? So you can agree that you do one part and I do the other part, right? But since we have the same preferences, we will want to achieve the same goal. And this is how affective agents can essentially cooperate. So in this regard, we see moral sentiments as essentially related to similarities between agents' affective values and affective values of others that the agent can indirectly kind of see through the features. I will explain in a second. But anyway, so all moral sentiments that we discussed today in this paper are essentially those related to some form of similarity between the agent and others. Okay, so before I continue with this, I would like to give a new definition. So this kind of idea that there are features with attached affective values to them very nicely connects to the idea of personal identity that comes from psychological literature. So imagine the set of all conceivable features that include essentially all objects, all people, and all concepts. By concepts, I mean, for example, things like bravery or sin or democracy, about which you can feel something. So all this huge set of all features that you can imagine, and then essentially we can define personal identity at time t as just a collection of all affective values that an agent currently associates with all these features. So we can then say that personal identity, thus defined, is just the sum of all your life experiences, because essentially anything that you experience in your life gets recorded in the features, and so anything that you ever perceived isn't there in some sense. So what does it give us if we assume that agents have personal identities, namely that they have affective values for any features imaginable? So when an agent is surrounded by any features f1 to fn, then essentially his mood will be perfectly determined by the affective values if we just sum them up, as I mentioned before. This is a good property because if the agent has a mood well specified in each situation, he can make a choice in situation of when there is some uncertainty. Right, so personal identity essentially determines agent's mood in any imaginable setting. And also what is interesting about this is that as you experience new things and you update your affective values, then your personal identity will also change because you update affective values, which are your identity essentially. So this kind of very simple idea creates a definition of personal identity that can change in time dynamically as you experience new things. Okay, so the most light version of cooperation that affective agents can have, we call it herd behavior. And essentially, the reason why it exists is because when agents meet, they do not see each other's affective values because they're hidden inside their heads. So the only way that agents can essentially deduce that someone is similar to them is through the idea that since other people maximize their affective values, then they will tend to have features that are surrounding them, or like things that they own, or things or places where they live, etc. All these things that surround them will somehow reflect the affective values that these people have, simply because they maximize, right? So when you maximize, you choose things that you like. So for example, if you walk on the street and you see someone in a Spider-Man t-shirt, you can deduce that this person probably likes Spider-Man, right? So, and the same kind of reasoning can be applied to many other things. So then if this is the case, then essentially if affective agents are attracted to other affective agents who have features that they like, then they will most likely end up hanging out with people who share the same affective values with them. So let me give you an example. So suppose, and essentially this defines a way of how you treat other people in this world of affective values. So imagine that agent I meets agent J for the first time, let's say, is introduced to agent J. And agent J has red hair, hat, and Spider-Man t-shirt. So then what can I do? I can compute the affective value of the feature fj that represents agent J by just summing up all the features that that agent has. And these are usually visible features. So you just sum up your own, by the way, affective value of red hair, hat, and Spider-Man t-shirt. And if agent I likes all these things like Spider-Man, hats, and red hair, then I will have high affective value for agent J. And if not, then agent will not have high affective value. So essentially what happens here is that agents have some visible features, and I just come towards agents who have visible features that I like. And by this mechanism, affective agents can essentially get together into this group of similarly minded agents. And then cooperate in some light way with each other. So let me give you an example. So this is a stack hunt game, which can be thought of as a form of light cooperation. So the difference between stack hunt and prisoner's dilemma is that in prisoner's dilemma, these payoffs are higher than 3, which essentially makes prisoner's dilemma a prisoner's dilemma. But here they're lower, which essentially turns it into a coordination game between, hunting hare or hunting stag. But of course, this game also has another property that if you choose to hunt stag, you get a 3 or a 0. And if you choose to hunt a hare, you get a 2 or a 1. And 2 and 1 represent less spread. So it's less risky in a sense to hunt a hare than a stag. But let's try to see what happens when effective players play this game. So when you are an effective player and you play this game, you essentially transform it into a problem under uncertainty. So if you know that if you choose S, you will get 3 or 0. So these are drawn here. And if you choose hare, you will get 2 or 1. This is here. So now if you have good mood, and remember the other player is also a feature, right? So if you play with that person, then his effective value enters your mood because you see the person. So this person creates certain effective value for you. So if you really like the other person, so you have good mood, then you will think that 3 or 2 will happen using mood affiliation. And then you will choose stag because 3 is bigger than 2. But if you have a bad mood because you meet someone who does not share similar features to you that you like, then you will choose between 0 and 1 because you will believe with mood affiliation that either 0 or 1 will happen. Then you will choose 1 and play hare. So this essentially tells us that when agents who can congregate together because of similarities of features that they share come together, they will play stag in this game. So they will cooperate with each other simply because they like each other, or they think that they like each other because they see similar features. Right? So essentially, this shows that these agents are capable of some light forms of cooperation without essentially caring about well-being of others directly. It's just because they like others since they wear Spider-Man t-shirts. So let me show you quickly another example. So this is a prisoner's dilemma. So now notice these payoffs are higher than payoffs here. So you always want to deviate from cooperating to defecting. So if we do the same exercise and we look at how effective agents play this game, then we see again through mood affiliation that if you are in a good mood, so you meet someone whom you like, you will still defect because 3 is still bigger than 2. So you will choose D. And if you do not like someone, you will also defect because you think that 1 will happen or 0. There is this one interval where you cooperate, but it's just a very small one in between 0 and 2. 1 and 2. So this game shows that even though effective agents can cooperate in some stack hunt type situations, they still cannot resolve prisoner's dilemma and cooperate in it, which also suggests to us that moral reasoning and cognitive abilities play important role in cooperation, since just on effective system you cannot do it. So how could effective agents increase their ability to cooperate? If we think about it, we can notice that the already known notion of social identity essentially tells us how this is possible. So imagine that you want to become an astronaut, and this social identity can be defined by some certain set of features. So we assume here that social identity is a subset of features with specific affective values attached to them, and that all agents that share this social identity should also share these affective values that attach to the features that are specific to this identity. So for example, social identity astronaut can be defined by a set of features: resilient, brave, spacesuit, and alcohol, and the corresponding affective value. So what does it mean? It means that astronauts should be resilient, so they should have high effective value for resilience, They should be brave, they should have spacesuits, so very high affective values for all these three features, and they should not drink alcohol, so they should have negative affective value for alcohol. They should not like it. So if you have all these features, then you can be considered an astronaut. So this is a general idea how we define social identity. So now, if two astronauts meet together, they will have a good plan, or they will agree on actions to, for example, fix a spacesuit, simply because this task involves features which are related to their social identity. And since they belong to this social identity, they will share these affective values, and thus in any task where they have to, do something professional related to their identity, they will agree on all the choices that they need to make. So in some sense, this is just a stronger form of cooperation based on specific chosen features that are predetermined in some specific identity. And as long as you are in it, you will be able to cooperate better. So same idea of similarity, only put on the next level. However, there are problems with this. So as I mentioned before, when you experience new things, your values get updated, right? So essentially, if two astronauts work apart from each other, then they might slowly with time diverge in their opinions about what it means to fix a spacesuit, because one astronaut had one experience and another had another. So slowly their affective values will drift away from each other simply because they update due to experience. So we know that, well, not that we know, but there is a good kind of idea that this is indeed happening, because we know that there are many manuals and especially rituals that make sure that affective values of social identity do not get very far away from each other. So the Bible is, for example, is a good example of a manual related to a social identity. So Bible contains many kind of descriptions of situations about how Christians should choose between certain things. And through it also says directly what you should value and what you should not value, right? So the Bible can be seen as a manual for a social identity Christian. And also rituals play an important role in making sure that social identity does not, fall apart because everyone just has different experiences. So rituals is a specific time when affective agents come together on some scheduled meetings where they essentially have common experience. So when people come to a church to listen to a priest, for example, they all have the same emotions. And this makes them closer together because when they have common emotion, their updating makes their affective values get closer to each other simply because it's a convex combination. And thus also we can define an in-group in the same way. So if we are all astronauts, then our in-group is astronauts, and everyone who is not an astronaut. So now we can think about what we call identity-based norms of individual behavior. So suppose we are all astronauts, but one of us does not uphold the values of our identity. For example, he drinks too much, right? So then we can judge that person because, we know that something is, he's not following the values of the identity. So imagine that agent J observes I partying instead of doing homework. And suppose that I wants to become an astronaut and he wants to learn about International Space Station. But instead of doing that, he chooses to party and agent J observes it. So now suppose that agent J has value A for homework and value B for partying, and A is bigger than B. So from the perspective of agent J, if he was, trying to become an astronaut, he would choose to do homework. And since agent I did not do it, then agent J has resentment towards agent I of the size A minus B. Why this size? Because essentially, when agent J thinks, why was it that agent I did not choose homework? Probably it was because his value of homework is below B, right? So it should be somewhere here since he chose to party, right? So then A minus B is just the representation of the most optimistic kind of measure of where agent I's value of homework is, right? And since agent I did not choose what agent J thought should have been chosen, agent J will feel resentment towards I and then get a negative effect, and then this will go into the updating of the feature related to agent I. So why is this all important? Is because essentially this behavior can help maintain social identity and hold it together and kind of reprimand or punish or exclude the agents who do not uphold the values of the identity. So let me give you another example of what happens when we consider this possibility. So let us look at the same games that I showed you before, only now instead of one feature, let's assume that, instead of one payoff, let's assume that a player gets actually a feature which is related to his identity. So for example, V1 can be the value that the agent attaches to, let's say, alcohol that he can get in this outcome. And suppose also that we have a social identity G, where everyone is supposed to have very low value V1, so that this game is essentially a stack hunt. And everyone else outside G can have V1 or V2. And V2, we assume, is higher than 3, which turns this game into a prisoner's dilemma, which we know affective agents cannot resolve. So what happens here essentially is that if I'm in G and I meet another person who has social identity G, I know that since we share social identities, we will both play cooperate, because essentially for us this game is a stack hunt. So I have value V1 and the other guy has value V1, so we both will choose to cooperate, as I just showed before. So this essentially leads to 100% cooperation among people who are belonging to social identity G. Outside social identity, though, situation will be much worse. So outside group G, people will at best get 50% cooperation, because there are also people who like to drink alcohol, so they will defect when playing this game because V2 is higher than 3. Also, it's important to notice that group members can protect themselves from being exploited by outsiders. So, for example, in two different ways. So if someone within identity G plays D, then we can punish that person through the mechanism I just described, because that person did not uphold the values of our identity, right? Thus, we can exclude that person, which will still maintain the cooperation within the group. And when we play with the outsider who does not have G, we will be in a bad mood, anyone who belongs to G, because that person does not share our values, thus we will defect against that person. So this example essentially shows how cooperation can be maintained among people who belong to some social identity versus people who do not belong to any. So final construction that we have here is about social status. So if you think that people from a young age kind of get attached to certain social identities, then it also makes sense to think that their motivations and goals will be related to becoming better at this social identity. For example, if you want to become an astronaut, then you will try to be resilient, brave, have a spacesuit, and not drink, right? So, and as a young agent, you will try to achieve this. So then essentially, we can think of social status within identity G is just as your relative position, or how many features, or what is the value of the features that are associated with this identity that you have. So the more features you have, the higher your social status will be within this identity. So if I'm an astronaut who has a spacesuit and Eric is an astronaut who doesn't, then my status will be higher. So we also assume that essentially in order to motivate agents to pursue their social identity, there can be an additional element to their mood, which we call anxiety. And this is just enters as a negative to your mood. It's just some constant times all the sum of all features that you do not have. For example, I'm an astronaut who lacks one feature to completely finish the set of all the features that astronauts should have. Then I will have anxiety equal to this amount. So what does this give us? So imagine a situation with the Joneses, with whom we're supposedly should be keeping up, right? So if the Joneses buy a new car, this essentially introduces a new element into a set of features relevant for identity. I don't know how to call it, but we can call it success in life, let's say. So the Joneses buy a new car, which essentially means that now success means that I also need to have a new car, which will essentially drop my mood by this amount, where instead of spacesuit, you can plug new car, right? So whenever Joneses buy a new car, I get upset because now I also need to have one, since this defines my social identity, and I will feel envy as a result. So let me give you a last example, and then I will finish. So it's interesting to ask a question: what happens when affective agents are interacting with each other in kind of market type situation? So for example, when they want to exchange goods. So imagine that we have two agents, both have some goods that they do not like or they don't care about, but the other person likes the good that the opposite person has. So what happens is that they can come together and exchange this, or they can sit and do nothing. Right, so this creates this game where if you enter, essentially you get a positive amount, which is the switched good from the other person, and if you choose to do nothing, then nothing happens and everyone gets a zero. So any rational agent in this game, standard selfish rational agent in this game, will enter as long as he believes that probability of enter is more than zero, that the other agent will enter with probability more than zero. So it's a pretty easy game to solve for rational agents, but affective agents have problems here. And the reason is because there is an uncertainty. So the option to not do anything gives affective agent value zero, but if you enter, then you have a lottery, which gives you X or zero, and there is also cost of uncertainty, which I didn't mention before just to save time. But we also assume that there is a cost of uncertainty. Just because you choose something uncertain, you have a cost of that. And this will create a situation in which essentially affective agents only enter if they like the opponent enough. So opponents should be trusted to a specific degree before affective agents will decide to enter in this game. And this makes a big difference, of course, because if you imagine some big, society, populated by affective agents, they will only then exchange goods with those that they like or those that they know, like friends and colleagues, etc., which creates essentially nepotistic networks. Another interesting implication of this is that essentially this structure that affective agents only trade with those they like does not allow them to fully capture the benefits that markets provide, because as we know from elementary economics, most benefits from trade happen when people who are very different trade with each other, not people who are similar, right? And this is what essentially we find important to note about affective agents, that they base their cooperation on similarity, whereas on markets, best cooperation happens between different individuals. Okay, so let me finish here and summarize a little bit. So we propose a model of biologically inspired boundedly-rational affective agent. Evolutionary pressure to cooperate gives this agent moral sentiments like friendly feelings, support of in-group, desire and respect for status, resentment, admiration. The model accounts for many behavioral irrationalities, and if you consider our full framework where we have a rational norm-following agent described in other papers, and this affective agent, then taken together, we believe they provide a good tool to study many forms of human behavior. All the papers can be found on my website, which is just my last name that you can copy-paste from somewhere. And yeah, thank you very much.
Great, Sasha. Thanks so much. Very engaging, very interesting. We had a number of interesting conversations in the chat. Eric was good at fighting them off and answering them. So, but maybe let me go backwards. So, Dawn, you had a couple of good comments that maybe are best voiced by yourself, but I can also read them out if you prefer.
Let me go, Jürgen, because I can put them in a better framework, I think, than I had in the chat. If that's okay. Thank you.
Of course. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. So I think this is a really interesting project if we see it as, let's see how far we can get in establishing foundations for sociality just with affect, right? That's an interesting question. But then I have some concerns about the way you're framing it, and they might look like they're just semantic concerns, but I think they're deeper than just how to talk. I mean, I think that when you frame it in terms of social identity, I worry that that invites you to be pretty profligate with the mechanisms you're willing to bring in when you're then working through toy cases. And what I mean by profligate is you're letting yourself have access to some pretty sophisticated mechanisms, like identifying a shared ritual or identifying a shared text like the Bible or something. Those are mechanisms for pretty cognitively sophisticated agents that have already done a lot of co-classification. Let me give you an example. I mean, a real concrete example, and that would suggest to me a different frame. I do experiments with elephants, and one of the things you have to learn is how to get to know new elephants when you meet an elephant that doesn't know you. And there's no doubt that one of the things you're basically doing is establishing a common empathetic reference point. So you must know how to pick up elephant mood indicators. And then you also need to know what they pay attention to with respect to that, and send a signal back that tells the elephant that you're tracking the elephant's mood, the way the elephant feels. And you can quite quickly get into a good space. And then you can go on to do other things while you're bothering. Now, notice that the frame I used there was not a social identity frame, right? I'm not trying to convince the elephant that I'm an elephant, or persuade the elephant to be a person. What I am trying to do is establish that we have that with respect to this, and if we first have to know something about what equivalence classes we recognize, what, in Christina's terms, what we're attending to. But again, we're trying to get as far as we can with affect alone. So I can't do any work with the elephant on that. I mean, that is, I have to assume that we're attending to some common things, or it doesn't start. But it seems to me what I'm trying to establish is that we're part of a common empathy network. And that, of course, is an Adam Smithian theme, which should be very congenial to you, right?
Yeah,
but I noticed,
definitely.
I'm surprised your whole talk, the word empathy never came up.
Well,
that's really what you're talking about, yeah?
We have a lot of empathy in the appendix of this paper. We just chose not to go that deeply into this. So, but we do go there indeed with the dissatisfaction and empathy. Yes, we have the whole other like a theory of moral way. Yeah. A theory of injunctive norms is the whole paper about essentially empathy.
But notice just to finish the point, to make it a good one, it seems that if you stress empathy rather than social identity in the first place, you'll be less like, that should tie your hands a little bit in a useful way in terms of what mechanisms you can invoke in your toy game. So that would make me cautious about appealing to a ritual or the Bible, right? I'd have to go with dimensions where empathetic discrimination is plausible, where discrimination just on the basis of empathy is plausible.
Can I ask, do you think everything up until the personal identity part of the talk you can get without empathy also, right? At least it seems to me that the coordination in the stag hunt, just because we like each other, we like the same things, it doesn't require me to be thinking about how you feel exactly. Does that seem right to you, Don?
Yeah, I mean, again, getting as far as you can with affect alone is a great project. Animals probably need to get quite a long way with just that, including humans. And then it invites the right questions at the end, but that's not going to get us markets because we need division of labor, and now we can't all be the same and blah blah blah. So you want to make sure you're not, if you reach too far, if you let yourself have access to too many mechanisms at the empathy coordination stage, then I worry that you're going to think you've achieved. You're going to you risk convincing yourself you've achieved more than you have, right? That that instead of the clean project of seeing how far we can get with empathy, we muddy the water because we give the impression that we're getting much further than is actually plausible. You see what I mean, right? So in other words, somewhere in here, there should be a criterion you're introducing on what kinds of dimensions are plausible dimensions for empathy signaling. And then the mechanism, you should restrict yourself, I'm thinking, to mechanisms that can be defined in terms of those dimensions. That's the suggestion.
Great.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
That was great. Don, I would not have been able to put this in your words, so thanks for taking that over. Christina, go ahead.
Yeah, following Don, I don't want to focus on empathy, but on the general question, how far can we go with affect alone? And I think there is a big jump at a certain point that you make. So let's go back for a moment. You talk about personal identity. You say personal identity is a collection of affective values. And obviously, this collection changes, with different experience and environment. And the problem is when you interact with other people, you only see behavior. And, there are many sets of affective values that explain the same behavior. So there is a problem there. Okay, so can you cooperate with others? What can we do with others? Well, here we have a problem. And so you try to solve this problem with the social identity story. Okay, now, and you say, well, the in-group social identity is being, defined by being in a group. And there are, of course, many, many types of social identities that we inhabit. And being in a group is defined by very specific features. Now, here is the big jump, because what happens with social identity is linked to social roles. And social roles are linked to script and schemata. So when I teach, my identity as a teacher is linked to a certain script, to certain things that I am expected to do as a teacher, and I expect people, like my students, for example, to do to me as a teacher, and so on and so forth. So when you look at social identity, already you enter a completely different non-emotional realm, which is basically the realm of script and schemata. The manual is a script, okay? Ritual, manual are part of, if you will, script and the norm that are embedded in the scripts. But once you have that, you have jumped from a pure emotional values to a more cognitive situation in which basically I know the rules that are attached to my particular role. And certainly when I meet another teacher, I know what to expect from this teacher as, especially a teacher in a culture that we both inhabit, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that when you want to move to cooperation, okay, you want to move to group identity, to social identity, but here the affect is just part of it, is not all of it. You need to introduce an important cognitive element. So it seems to me that once you want to explain cooperation, either you may go into the empathic type of sentiments. A lot of people think that empathy is crucial to morality and so on and so forth. And I don't disagree with that. But the important thing here, you make this big jump to social identity, because personal identity alone doesn't allow me to do much. Social identity does. Social identity is also a strongly cognitive concept, and not just based on emotion. So it seems to me that going back to the initial question, how far can we go with emotion? Well, we stop there.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with you, Christina, that there is a big cognitive component in all this. We just, it just occurred to us that rituals mostly is something like manuals we added kind of later, but rituals was the thing that we mostly concentrated on first. That is just an idea that it's so easy to see why these things happen. It's just in order to, maintain these values in check, kind of. But of course, I totally agree with you that there is a big cognitive component to this in deciding, like, in, writing these manuals, for example.
And if I can add one word only, because you say, oh, if, let's say I have the identity in this moment of an astronaut, and I see this other guy who's an astronaut that drinks like crazy, say, oh my God, and there is resentment. I don't think there is resentment, that the right emotion is resentment, as the right thing to be, that matters, what Joe Hyrick thinks, basically, is a social status matter. Social status matter for certain identities, not others. So having a social identity generally is a sort of a very reassuring thing, because you know what to do. You know what's expected of you, basically. I think that social status is a very limited type of explanation. As much as the resentment, I don't resent this other guy drinking alcohol. It's just, I think, he's a bad guy. I think he's stupid. I may think a lot of things about this guy, but not resenting or wanting to punish him. We don't punish
maybe it's just a bad example. Like what we tried to say here is essentially that it's a general idea about cooperation. So if I see someone who belongs to some social identity, let's say a doctor, forget about astronauts, let's take medical doctors, right? So I see a medical doctor who is, doing something, let's say cheating on a medical exam, right? I know that this doctor might, will be curing me in the future. So for me, it's a direct threat. So it's not that I resent this person because he is cheating on the exam, but I resent this person because he is not doing what his social identity tells him he should be doing. And that can be dangerous for the community, because if someone in some social identity is not performing some functions in a right way, then everything can collapse or something, right? So I resent the fact that this person is not cooperating with others as he should be. So, but not for drinking specifically.
Certainly there is a moral anger there. And I know because I proved that in experiments. I want to add one thing about identity and cooperation. All the experiments that have been done on pre-play communication in trust game, social dilemma game, and so on and so forth. And you also know that even when you want to create, and you do create a social identification, cooperation will not happen. Cooperation will only happen when people talk about the game and sort of promise or enter into some sort of commitment to cooperate. So social identity per se is not so necessary for cooperation, because we have a lot of examples in which they induce social identification pretty strong. They measure it, but cooperation doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting...
I can send you the papers. It's really interesting, because there was this debate, my induced social identity, then they cooperate. And these people say, no, they don't.
Well, I mean, we do not say that only people with social identity can cooperate. But I mean, yeah. Well, this it would be interesting to know that maybe, how did they induce it? Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe, I don't know, maybe this refers to only identities that you learn as a child. I don't know. But yeah,
So I think this is a good point to let the visitors, the attendees go. But I think, part of this discussion also points to the idea of like higher order beliefs and the relevance of, not only like identities, but also what you think other people will do in social interaction contexts, right? And so there are a couple more questions that we posed in the comment section that Eric addressed that we give you guys to, access to after this meeting is over, so you can also check them out. Yeah, Sasha, Eric, this was great. Thanks so much. Go check out the many cool papers that these two have produced if you haven't already. This was very insightful, and yeah, see you all in 2 weeks, hopefully.
Thanks.
You just stick around, Eric.
I just stick around.
Okay. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
See
you.
in 2 weeks.